chapter is going to look at mechanobiology. So what we're essentially going to be looking at here is we're kind of going back to some more of just kind of the physiology, but now we're going to look at it from the perspective of what happens when we actually apply different types of stress, particularly to the musculoskeletal system. So the whole concept of mechanobiology looks at a lot of the signals that occur as a result of stress to the tissue, because essentially with rehabilitation, that's what we're looking to do. We're looking to create a healing response, not only just to heal the tissue, but also to get the tissue back to its normal functioning. So we apply different types of stresses through particularly different types of exercise and also through some manual therapy. So a lot of the manual therapies that we're talking about will apply some different types of stresses to these different tissues. So it's important for us to kind of realize that, again, what we're essentially looking to do is at some point mobilize and move tissue to create some of these cellular effects. So I'm going to point out some of the more important structures. Your textbook will get into some other things. I will kind of highlight what I kind of really want you to know in regards to the different types of tissue and kind of how they respond to stress. As I said, when we're going to be looking at the mechanobiology here, we're essentially looking at the interaction between the mechanical stimulus on the cells and tissues. So again, when we're applying things, when you look at, for instance, tendinopathies, and we look at, eccentric strengthening for tendinopathies, there's a reason why that helps and has been found to be effective in healing tendinitis, if you will. So we're going to look at the interaction between that, and more particularly looking at the endocrine system. So the endocrine system plays an extremely important role here with some of the hormones that get produced that help and allow for tissue healing to occur. So we're looking at the concept. So we talk about mechanobiology. We're essentially looking at the mechanism and how mechanical energy is transformed into chemical signals resulting in cell-mediated tissue responses. Mechanotransduction works with this process, and basically what mechanotransduction is, it looks to convert mechanical energy into chemical signals. So basically what we're looking at here is, again, taking some type of outside stress or force and convert that into a signal that essentially is going to help with repair, okay? And these different factors are going to work into some of the endocrine system hormones and things of that nature in order to allow for musculoskeletal tissue healing to occur, and not only to have the healing occur, but have it occur in an optimal manner. So we're going to be looking at some of the different things as far as the hormones. For instance, as an example, one of the more important hormones that are produced by tissues, by the resident musculoskeletal cells, are your cytokines. Okay, so cytokines are one example of a hormone that gets produced as a result of having this stress applied. And again, that could assist with the healing process. So there's various types of hormones that will get produced with this. We also look at, an important area in the body in the endocrine system is the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, which is which is a part of the endocrine system that is very important in influencing musculoskeletal tissue. Okay, so if you go back to your anatomy on the endocrine system, so the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis is the axis responsible for regulation of the immune and reproductive system, but in addition to that, it also helps with musculoskeletal functions of healing, remodeling, and different types of adaptation. So we'll talk about the importance of that and what it means as far as how different tissues, the vasculature, their blood supply, how that actually influences that. So another thing related to mechanical signaling is Wolff's Law. So the textbook talks about Wolff's Law, and that's when you look at which is kind of essentially the initial thing that came out as far as stress to bone. Okay, so Wolff's Law was basically looking at bony changes. So when you have disuse of bone, your bone mass tends to decrease because your body is constantly remodeling and restructuring your bone, but it's dependent upon use. So disuse of bone causes your bone mass to decrease because your body has no way of, no real need to have thick bone mass if you're not using it. Well, that a lot of those same principles apply to the extracellular matrix. So the importance of the extracellular matrix is that's essentially the part of our body that helps to support the cells. So it provides the tissue architecture that actually allows for support of your cells. So it's the same types of laws in regards to stresses as they relate to bone does also apply to your other tissue. So it's important that we know how to structure the stresses as we're applying it with exercise. And that takes us to our different types of collagen. So we know that collagen is the basic protein that makes up our soft tissue. So the collagen, as we look at it, there's different types of collagen. We've talked about some of them already. In particular, we've looked at type 1 and type 3. So type 1 we know is our strong collagen. That's essentially what we look to have, essentially replacing when we have tissue damage. We want type 1 collagen. That's basically our strongest, most aligned collagen. Type 3 is not nearly as strong as type 1, but it's kind of our, as your textbook gives it the name reparative collagen, okay? So our type 1 collagen is abundant. It's actually in bone as well. So there is type 1 collagen in bone. It provides even strength for bone, and it's produced by fibroblasts. Your type 3 collagen is your reparative collagen. So this is kind of, again, that collagen that comes in as a part of the repair process. It's not nearly as strong as type 1, but it at least provides the framework via which type 1 collagen can come in and replace. We didn't really talk about type 4. Type 4 is basically found in what they call basement membranes. And again, it has a mesh-like structure, and it allows for multidirectional stresses. So I mean, again, obviously tissue is pretty much remodeled along its lines of stress. So again, depending upon how tissue stresses occur, it's usually how the collagen is lined up. Type 4 collagen is kind of more mesh-like and allows for multidirectional stresses. So this is important for like blood vessel lining and in different body compartments, just the general connective tissue. So that's essentially where type 4 collagen comes into play. So here's kind of an illustration that comes out of your textbook, and what this shows is how much endocrine support the tissue gets based on its blood flow. So you see here, obviously the combination of tissue stresses and blood flow kind of influences how many hormones are going to be delivered. Now, here's the thing. So you see that cartilage and tendon, for instance, they do not have very good blood supply. Now, the important thing to note is that even in tissues with limited endocrine access, they do have the ability locally to synthesize hormones, okay? So we also, in addition to the endocrine system, which, produces hormones, they get released in the bloodstream and then they work somewhere else at a distant site in the body, you also have what are called autocrine and paracrine effects. So that's for a little bit more local regulation. That would be in your tissues that don't have as much blood flow. Again, cartilage and tendon being examples of that. So again, autocrine effects are essentially when a cell produces a hormone that actually acts on the same cell, whereas paracrine effects are effects produced by a cell that's nearby, okay? And again, that's going to be important when you're looking at tissues that don't have good blood flow, because if they don't have good blood flow, it makes it much more difficult for the endocrine system to work. So that's why it's important that some of these other hormones can be produced in these cells and kind of work a little bit more locally. Whereas, again, some of the tissues, for instance, like muscle, has a very good blood supply. they can have a greater response to hormones produced by endocrine glands. Okay, so just some examples. So a hormone produced within tissue by resident cells, an example of that is a cytokine. Um, Insulin growth factor 1 is another hormone. It's produced by the liver, as well as cytokines produced by cells and tendons. So again, you're seeing how, depending upon, the biggest key here is essentially blood flow. So the blood flow to the tissue will dictate what interaction, as far as how the hormones, where they're produced, and how they'll actually impact the tissue, with when you're talking about actual tissue healing and this whole concept of mechanical stresses producing that. Okay, so looking at some of the important structures, and again, I'm going to highlight some of the important things. The one structure really important as far as the communication between the actual tissue and the cellular responses, which will produce a lot of the hormone issues in regards to remodeling and tissue adaptation, is the integrin receptor. Okay, so integrin receptors, it's the main receptor to organize and assemble the extracellular matrix. So essentially, again, that extracellular matrix, which is going to support the cell, is going to be basically assembled and put together through signals that come through this integrin receptor. It also links the extracellular matrix with the intracellular environment. So essentially what this is saying is the cells that make up the tissue, okay, which obviously support it, are going to be connected with the actual tissue components itself. So again, as mechanical signals come through, it's going to essentially affect what the cells do, and how they respond, and in regards to a situation where healing has to take place, how the hormones and everything gets produced. Now, as far as integrin goes, there's two parts of it. There's the extracellular domain, which is the direct connection that just binds the extracellular matrix components. There's then also what's called the intracellular domain, which is directly connected to what's called the actin cytoskeleton. Okay, so what the actin cytoskeleton does is essentially it's a filament that basically bridges the gap between the integrin receptor and the nuclear membrane. So what this does is it helps to organize and directly link what goes on in the cell with what happens as far as force production through the tissue. So basically, through this structure, the mechanical signals actually get transmitted to the cell nucleus, and then that's what allows for things like gene transcription, protein production, and remodeling. So think of the intracellular part of the integrin receptor, and the connection to the actin cytoskeleton kind of being the direct line between what goes on with the tissue stress and what actually happens in the cell. And that's what's going to be what produces a lot of the elements in regards to just even adaptation to exercise in general, even without tissue damage, will produce this. So that's an important component of this. So this forms the direct line for force transduction, and what actually happens as far as the cells producing different components in regards to stress. Picture, you could see the integrin receptor in relation to the extracellular matrix and the cell. So if we look up here, so here's your integrin receptors right here, okay, and they're basically interacting. These are all components of the extracellular matrix. Then as you look here, how it interacts with the cell membrane, here you have your actin cytoskeleton, and how that connects from the integrin receptor into the nucleus. So it's just a picture kind of illustrating some of the different parts, and how the integrin receptor binds with not only the tissue components in the extracellular matrix, but also how it connects intracellularly with the actin cytoskeleton and how that interacts with the nucleus of the cell. Already about the extracellular matrix. So essentially what we're looking at is the non-cellular connective tissue. So again, we two big things we've talked about so far. We've talked about the importance of the communication and what happens at the cell. Now we're looking at the actual connective tissue. So the connective tissue needs cells in order to survive. The cells need the connective tissue in order to, again, have that mechanical signaling take place for the cells to produce what they need to for the tissue, but they also provide the environment for the cells to essentially exist. And the non-cellular connective tissue basically is comprised of two different things, which we've talked about already. You have your fibrous proteins, which, again, the most abundant fibrous protein is your collagen. There are others located as well. So you have, again, you have your collagen, which is the predominant component of your connective tissue. You have something called elastin, which provides for elasticity in the tissue. So all of our tissues throughout our body, and depending upon where they're located and what their responsibility is, there's a degree of elasticity there, meaning they can be stretched and go back to their normal structure. And you have another fibrous component, which is called fibronectin, which we'll talk about a little bit in some of the different roles that plays. But those are your fibrous components. Now we've talked a little bit about the different types of collagen. Your collagen type 1 is your strongest, and that's what primarily makes up a lot of the soft tissue in the musculoskeletal system. Again, it's collagen that's going to be aligned along the lines of stress and provide strength for the tissue. Your type 3 collagen is a web-like tissue, and essentially it's a reparative type of collagen that comes in once a structure is damaged due to injury. And then you have your type 4 collagen, which is kind of more mesh-like, and again is primarily for what we call basement membranes. So it's for structures that kind of are going to undergo multi-directional stresses, for instance, like blood vessels, and then just some of the connective tissue that connects some of our organs and kind of separates different body compartments into different areas. There's also type 2 collagen, which we're actually going to talk about a little bit on the next slide, and that's the collagen that is going to primarily make up your cartilage. So we look at this, and again, as we said, this extracellular matrix is comprised of two things. It is the fibrous proteins and it is the polysaccharides. And the polysaccharides are what make up the other component of this, which is your ground substance, okay? So the ground substance is that gelatinous water substance that forms in between the actual fibers. Now, in addition to, again, just providing an environment for the fibers, there's a lot of things that the polysaccharides do. And the polysaccharides are primarily made up of three substances. They're made up of proteoglycans, they're made up of glycosaminoglycans, and water. So the proteoglycans, I'll talk about hyaluron in a bit. The proteoglycans are important for chemoattraction. So we know that chemoattraction happens as a part of the repair process. So during the repair process, when tissue gets damaged, you have chemicals that gets produced, and what that does is it provides a stimulus for attracting certain cells to the region. So we talked about, just for instance, the attraction of white blood cells to the area, the attraction of the different reparative types of cells into the area. This area is responsible for that. Proteoglycans also protect new proteins from degrading, and they help in the orientation of collagen. So they help with that. They assist with the formation of new tissue. So this substance we talk about has some very important responsibilities from that mechanotransduction standpoint, and being able to help with tissue repair. They also help with just general cell membrane function as well. Now, hyaluron is, it's also called hyaluronic acid, is a glycosaminoglycan molecule. So that's another component of the ground substance. And the primary responsibility of that is to form force resistant, again, that gelatinous network. So the other responsibility of the extracellular matrix is, again, just to help with force resistance and provide structure to the tissue. The other thing that when we look at the combination of with hyaluron is that when bound to another type of proteoglycan also helps to form what's called a type 2 collagen, which is the collagen that primarily makes up cartilage. Okay, so that's part of the reason why when cartilage gets damaged, it's a little complicated because it's a tissue in the body, but it's primarily made up of type 2 collagen because of what its responsibility is. Okay, so here's a figure illustrating the different components of the extracellular matrix molecules. So this is the components of a lot of our tissues that we have. When you think about tendons, ligaments, cartilage, all of those different things are basically made up of all of these different components. So we have the fiber-based components, which you see along here. You have your type 1 collagen. So this provides strength and tensile strength in the tissue. Here is your type 3 collagen. Okay, so type 3 collagen, as we talked about in the earlier chapter at the beginning of the year, we discussed how during the inflammatory and repair phase, you get type 3 collagen to just stabilize the wound and just kind of hold that area for repair purposes. Down here, as I talked about earlier, we talked about collagen type 4, and this is very prominent in basement membranes. So a lot of the different types of tissue that separates our components. So basically structures that require multi-directional stresses. So if you look at collagen type 1, usually those fibers kind of go along the lines of stress. For collagen type 4, it's looking at structures that have to withstand stress from multiple directions. Over on this side, we have a lot of the components of the proteoglycans. So here we have decorin, which is prominent in a lot of connective tissue. Aggrecan is very prominent in cartilage. Fibronectin is actually another fibrillary component that's very prominent in a lot of our other soft tissue. So fibronectin is actually still a more fiber-based component in our connective tissue. So if we look down at the bottom, down in here, hyaluron along with aggrecan basically makes up, and along with type 2 collagen, they're just showing you an example here of a complex between the two. And this is essentially what you would get when you look at between type 2 collagen, aggregan, and hyaluron are going to make up your cartilage. So just kind of showing you some of the different tissues. So again, you have the more fiber-based components, and then you also have the proteoglycans, which make up a lot of like the things like your ground substance in tissues.